So this is the 15th, I think the penultimate class, if I recall correctly, that you've had in the Miller curriculum.
Well, according to the calendar, there's 2 next month.
Is there 2 more? So we're going to talk about actually quite a few things today, because there's a little bit on healing, and then there's quite a bit on funerals and mourning, and the period after that. And there's actually an opportunity, if you're interested, part of the core curriculum deals with end-of-life decision making, which is an area I work in quite a bit. So, so depending on your interest, we can dig deeper into different components. So the first thing, maybe somebody wants to read. Are you comfortable kind of rotating reading? Do you do that usually? Yeah. Yeah. If you've studied brachot, you may have come across this text. Anybody want to take a read?
Rabbi Hayabar Abba fell ill, and Rabbi Yochanan went to visit him. He asked, do you want your suffering? He answered, neither my suffering nor its reward. He said to him, give me your hand. He did it, and he raised him to health. Rabbi Yochanan fell ill, and Rabbi Hanina went to visit him. He asked, do you want your suffering? He answered, neither my suffering nor its reward. He said to him, give me your hand, and he raised him up to health. Is this really so? Why could Rabbi Yochanan not raise himself up? And it is, as they say, a prisoner cannot free himself from jail.
So what's going on here? What's happening in the first paragraph? Rabbi Chia bar Abba is sick. Rabbi Yochanan comes.
And Rabbi Yochanan was able to heal him.
Exactly. Yeah.
But
Yeah,
they
this
could
is
not
part
heal.
of a larger discussion about whether suffering is an affliction of love and is something that God sends in a good way, but we don't have to go there today. This is our discussion today is more about healing. So Rabbi Yochanan has the power to heal his friend. Why can't he heal himself in the second paragraph?
People need other people.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And it creates then a mitzvah for us to go and heal, to visit and heal other people. Does it bring up any, do you have any recollection? There's a couple texts in Torah that speak to this same mitzvah of healing, couple that really usually are cited. So one, remember when Abraham circumcises himself and his servants, his staff, and he's visited then by messengers, right, angels, who we interpret as people coming to comfort him and make him feel better. Bikor cholim, visiting the sick. Another example is when Miriam is struck, you might remember, with scales, whatever that means, when she and Aaron are protesting about Moses. And Moses then appeals to God and he says, God, please heal her. So as God heals the sick, like Abraham and Miriam, so we're supposed to heal the sick. And we do that sometimes medically, sometimes by visiting. So there are lots and lots of Jewish guides to how to visit the sick. Do you want to comment on what makes that easier or harder? Have you been to hospitals probably to visit people?
Make it easier or harder for whom?
Well, exactly, for the visitor, right? So how do we conduct ourselves, right? When you visit someone, and later on, we're going to talk about the same question related to mourning and Shiva. So the aim is to give a hand, right? Not necessarily to assume that we can heal, but to do what we can to reach out and make contact. And I think that's kind of what we take away from brachot, is that touch and that connection. One of the things that was so difficult over the past year, obviously, the lack of ability to visit people who were sick.
So
Mhm.
I was going to mention two things or personal experiences with one with my wife when she was teetering back and forth between being with us and not. That's a complicated story, but the fact is that she tells me that what motivated her to continue to persist and to fight rather than to just fade away and just give up was 2 or 3 visits. One, when our eldest grandson came to see her, and she was then motivated to continue to fight. Just she wouldn't eat, and she wasn't eating for weeks, much at all. And she said, "No, I have to do something because I want to be able to continue to see my grandson." And just somebody else had visited her and brought her one of her favorite foods that she wasn't receiving, and that helped her get a few more calories into her system when she needed it, and that was very helpful. So then you have both examples, something that the patient received, was motivated by the visit, and also the people who came to visit her and helped motivate her. In a sense, do you say it's a reward to have grandma with us many years later, or friends? Or then how does it help us feel when we go to visit, I know some of our friends or someone we know are in a bad way, or certainly are not going to make it at all. I can give you the example of my uncle. He was on the edge, and he just would not at all. I mean, he was very old, and so my wife and my daughters were there with him, and they just took him in their arms and kept on reciting the Shema with him, just to make him feel better. He's very religious, just to comfort him. There was nothing else anybody could do for him. And
Those are beautiful.
So then it was one last way of comforting him and sharing some love and affection that made it easier for the person in his last moments to pass on, rather than be alone, because he was a widower for decades. And so then he wasn't alone the last, and even we would go visit him for years. There's not much we could do except try to make him comfortable the last few years. And then at the very end, so he didn't feel alone. So it's different, and it was something that in a sense was rewarding to my wife and my daughters. Unfortunately, I was away on business when this happened all of a sudden. I was in the other side of town. I had to come rushing over. But so it's something that we all remember with quite a bit of affection. So it helps both people, but sometimes you just don't know what to do. I mean, my wife or the daughters had never been in that circumstance before, and said, "What do you do? What's difficult to do or not to do?" And it was just something that naturally they knew he would comfort him. So it was almost, shall I say, from what we learned through our years of practicing Judaism, that was the appropriate thing to do.
That's beautiful.
So
instead of saying, the only thing I might disagree with is when you said there was nothing we could do. You did the most.
Well, in the sense that there was no way was nothing else we could do.
Yep.
Because as far as trying to heal him with his physical deterioration, arrived at a point. The same with my father. He was 95, and he had what we call that. He went septic,
Yep.
And
Yep.
then there's nothing else you can do medically. Let me put
Yep.
that in to qualify it with medically that you can do.
Yep.
And
Yep.
at this
Yep.
stage, if there was going to be a miracle, it would have happened. So with the other things that were from other conditions he had. So in
Yeah.
that sense, nothing else you could do but.
Right. So there's physical healing and spiritual.
Yes.
You may be familiar with the Debbie Friedman Mishaberach. Most of us have heard it, and I could leave that for you to listen to if you'd like. But this is the text where Moses prays to God to heal Miriam. So it's a partnership. It's us and God healing. And what we pull from that is we acknowledge that it's not our decision. We don't get to decide when it's time to end life. We have an obligation to protect the body and advance health. And so we're going to explore a lot what it means to guard, shamor, shmirat haguf, to protect and guard our bodies and take good care of ourselves. So do you know some of the halacha, some of the rules, laws around taking care of our bodies? Anything familiar to you? So an example might be, it may not be widely known that tattooing is discouraged, for example, in our tradition. Refusing medical care that will work is discouraged. There's quite a big debate right now about the COVID vaccine and where halacha falls down on that. There are different points of view, but those who think it's a proven treatment think that it's halachically required. Some people think of it a little differently, but the whole idea that the body doesn't belong to you, that we don't have complete autonomy, is really the idea we want to take away. That's very different from an American perspective, where we think of everything as being our rights. And so as we get through to the rest of the content, particularly end of life, this is going to be extremely fundamental, and it may be shocking to you. Maybe you've thought about it, but it may surprise you. So you may have an advance directive. These are some examples of advance directives in our society: power of attorney, a living will, or some people use something called 5 wishes. There's a physician order for life-sustaining treatment. What do you think about these concepts, and how do they fit with the idea that the body is not just ours to deal with any way we want? Any thoughts about what would Judaism say, for example, about an advance directive, a living will, or a power? What is a power of attorney? Does anybody know?
Power of attorney is where you give someone else the ability to make medical decisions for you if you're incapacitated.
Perfect.
I remember my mother having one, and I was having to make medical decisions for her.
Perfect. And perhaps some of you have completed one?
Oh yeah, we have.
Oh, yep. I would think that most of us should, is my opinion. And what you're going to see is that the current thinking in the conservative movement is the same, that it is strongly recommended that there be advance directives. And in fact, the conservative movement has developed their own document, which is available online, which you can certainly take a look at. At the end of today's class, I have a link to it in case you're interested. So Are you allowed to decide what you want? In light of what we said earlier, do you get to decide yes or no resuscitation, yes or no organ donation, ventilator, autopsy, topics like this? What do you think? So in American medical ethics, autonomy is the principal leading value. There are others, but the person's decision making is paramount. How would you think about that in a Jewish framework?
What is the Jewish framework?
Well, exactly. So if the body doesn't belong to us, if God has a say, you could go completely to one end of the spectrum and say, no intervention at all. Let nature take its course. God will do whatever. Well, we don't embrace that. We believe in medical treatment and in the innovations that, God has given human beings the wisdom to create. But on the other end of the spectrum, what about deciding to end your life whenever you choose? Do we have complete autonomy? Let's explore one example of the debate. So why don't, I don't know, Susan, if you want to unmute and read this?
On the day that Rabbi Judah was dying, the rabbis declared a public fast and offered prayers for God's mercy. Rabbi Judah's maid went up to the roof and prayed. The angels desire that Rabbi Judah come and join them, and the mortals on earth desire that he remain with them. However, when she saw how much he was suffering, she offered a second prayer. May it be the will of God that the angels overpower the mortals. As the rabbis continued their incessant prayers, she took a jar and threw it off the roof. Momentarily distracted, the rabbis ceased their prayer, and Rabbi Judah's soul was able to depart.
This is a very famous story, widely used in Jewish medical ethics, always gives me chills. What's going on here? Susan, how do you interpret what's going on here?
So, on the one hand, they want the rabbi to live, and so they're praying very hard for that. But then the maid sees that I don't know, the quality of life may not be the right term, but his health, his situation is sort of hopeless, and so she changes her prayer and actually creates a situation for the rabbi to have a moment alone to die in peace.
Right. So there's so much going on here. One is the idea that the rabbi's prayers prevent him from dying, that their prayers are so powerful and so effective that he continues to suffer terribly, but cannot actually die, even though the angels are wishing for him to do so and join them. So she takes the initiative. She takes an action to distract the rabbis and interrupt their prayers. So why do we share this story, and why might it be useful in medical ethics? How would you apply this to real life?
That there's a point at which it's better to let go when all
Yes.
options have been exhausted, that you're just, in a sense, maybe prolonging the will of God, playing God.
Right. And yes, perfect. And even more, if you think of the prayers of the rabbis as being like a ventilator or like a medication, it suggests to some people that the time comes when you can actually remove that intervention. Just like the prayers stopped, perhaps there's time when you can turn off an actual medical intervention. And that is how this can be interpreted in today's world at times, but only when you've got a certain situation. Someone is on the verge of death, there's suffering, everything's been tried. There's almost an equal pull between earth and angels, right? So it's not like we just say, shut everything off anytime you want. There's lots of things going on here, but it's an important story, and you'll see it quoted a lot in medical ethics. What's your reaction? Anybody?
I think it's a great idea. We shouldn't, I mean, we don't ask animals to suffer needlessly. We shouldn't ask people to do that too.
Right. Although I'm glad you said that, because we're going to talk a little bit about some of the boundaries. So the text we just talked about suggests you cannot hasten death, but if something is interfering with death, you can remove it. Okay? There's a big difference. When we talk about animals, we're in a little bit different page, and I do want to pull that thread in a minute. But we want to create some boundaries so that we can't just say, tomorrow, it's enough. Grandma's lived long enough, and seems like she's not very comfortable, and everything. There has to be a careful consideration of what we're removing and if the person is near death. So let's look at
And medical practice is an excuse me, the medical practice, it all depends on the doctors and the procedures with which they are familiar. You can go from one doctor to the next, from one hospital to the next, and the equipment they have and their knowledge is different. So it's not that easy to make from my experience, just with some of my wife's conditions, that it's the criteria varies just from the experience of the doctors and what their particular area of expertise is. So it's tricky.
it is
Very tricky. Sorry to interrupt, but
no, you're right. So we're going to explore for a second how you think Judaism might react to these concepts. So Judith mentioned suicide or euthanasia. So what is the difference? Does anybody want to clarify? What's the difference between those two?
Well, suicide is when you do it yourself, and euthanasia is when somebody else does it.
Yeah, precisely. Thank you. So when are these okay and when are they not okay?
I would guess suicide is never okay. I don't know about euthanasia though.
Well, it all depends if the person is has asked for assistance to commit suicide. Look what everybody knows about or should not know, but the one example is this comedian Robin Williams. He had a diagnosis of some disease that he said he couldn't live with, and he ended it all. Other folks who have that, and they find a way to live with it. They find a purpose. They find some treatments. So,
So in our tradition, suicide is never okay as a simple autonomous act. However, it is not suicide to say, I am dying, remove the barriers. It is not suicide to say, I'm dying, I will discontinue certain types of treatment. Can you think of a case in the Bible where somebody committed suicide and the Bible seems to look at it favorably? There's one case. So in Samuel, the very end of the book, Saul is at war with the Philistines, and they wound him terribly. And he asks his servant to kill him. And the servant refuses, at which point he falls on his own sword. And that appears to be treated favorably. However, consider the fact that the Bible has just told us that he's been horribly wounded, which we would reasonably interpret as he was dying. And the Bible tells us he did not want the Philistines to torture him, humiliate him, treat him with disrespect. And so he had a reason to go ahead and complete his death. So our tradition says suicide is never permitted except if it is the only way to avoid the three major sins, cardinal sins, which are murdering someone else, sexual improprieties, and idol worship. But other than those three situations, suicide is never okay. Now, if someone commits suicide, there are those who believe, and there are sources which say they should not be buried, for example, in a Jewish cemetery, so forth, in sanctified ground. The rabbis, particularly in the conservative movement, consistently have ruled that if someone does commit suicide, clearly they were mentally deranged at the time, and therefore it is okay to include them in a Jewish cemetery. Now, obviously, that's going to be decided in each situation. I personally have never heard of a case where it was treated differently. So suicide, we do frown on suicide. What about euthanasia? What about making a decision for someone else, kind of like a pet, and saying, it's time, we're going to give them some medication that will end their life?
Does a patient know it, or is someone doing that out of the kindness of their, in quotation marks,
Right.
kindness of their hearts, just to avoid suffering, and the patient is unaware of it?
Yeah, so, right. In our tradition, if someone is not actively and imminently dying, it's never okay, as we just saw, to hasten their death, right? That was the text from the Shulchan Aruch, the halachic book of law that we have. It is forbidden to do anything to hasten the death of one who's in the process of dying. And if they're not in the process of dying, then that's murder, right? If they are capable of living longer, even with suffering, we may not kill them, even if they beg us to. If they're imminently dying, we're not allowed to hasten it, but we can remove barriers. So these are very fine distinctions. And in the real world, as you pointed out, it gets very complicated, which is why ethics is always case by case. There's no hard and fast rules, and you really need to know the situation before you can be clear. So let's back up from the moment of dying to this concept of life support. When is life support just a barrier to death? And when is it actually treatment? What do you think? When is it okay to remove? When is it not okay?
I would think that life support sometimes is necessary to get someone over a crisis where there's a good chance of recovery, where there's something to look forward to.
Yeah, I think that's well said. And then, as Charles pointed out, there's so much uncertainty in medicine. How do we know when it's a bridge to a possible recovery, even if the quality of life may not be great? And when is it, as we sometimes say, a bridge to nowhere? Just a bridge to nothing, staying on life support indefinitely without recovery, simply inching towards death. So that's again why it's case by case. When we become convinced that life support is nothing but a barrier to death, the person is dying, and this is just, as they said, like wood chopping or salt on the tongue, and I can explain those if you're curious, then we get to remove it. A little bit like the maidservant throwing the jug down from the roof of Rabbi Judah's house. So let's say that the person does, in fact, appear to be dying. What do we think about organ donation? We said earlier, the body doesn't belong to us. We're not allowed to disfigure it. Respect for the body is really a very paramount value in Judaism. What do we think about organ donation, which occurs, in the minutes right around death?
Well, I don't know what the Halacha says, but it seems to me that if our body belongs to God, and there's a part of our body that can be used to help preserve another life, then it should be certainly not only okay, but encouraged.
Right, and that's where the liberal movements of Judaism, the conservative movement and the reform movement and so forth, have all landed there. And there's a wonderful Orthodox source. It's I think it's HODS.org, the Halachic Organ Donation Society, which is really beautifully put together, which also represents very thoughtful and text-based support for organ donation from the Orthodox movement, although there are subsets of the Orthodox movement that disagree. So one of the dilemmas, in fact, is that these subsets that do not believe in donation are still willing to accept an organ, which creates a very complicated dynamic, for example, in Israel. But we don't have to go there today. Our what is taught, the overwhelming majority of Jewish leaders would say yes, organ donation is, as Ed very beautifully said, not only permitted but encouraged. If you can save a life, and certainly kidney, lung, heart, these are organ donations that save a life. You could argue about some other things, skin and so forth, but yeah. So most of us, I would guess, have an organ donor card and should feel comfortable that that's very consistent with what our tradition teaches. And now, what about autopsy? This is a very complicated one. Again, we know that respect for the body, even after death, is a very important value. What do we think about autopsy?
Seems to me that it would be illegal.
And
Although
indeed,
I don't think it's immoral in the right circumstance.
Yep. Yeah, and indeed, it is discouraged in most, certainly conservative and Orthodox circles, although where would be the cases where you would think it might be encouraged?
I think where an autopsy might help further medical knowledge, so it could save other lives.
Yeah, and it's very tricky, right? So if it's merely theoretical, there is a big division of opinion. So every autopsy helps to teach someone something, right? potentially medical students, potentially the pathologists. But if it's merely a theoretical benefit, there are those who say, no, that's not compelling enough. But if the person died of an unknown cause and the autopsy might help yield knowledge for their descendants, for specific people who are kind of on the edge of their chair wanting information that could help their lives, or if they died of a rare disease where there could be knowledge to be learned, in those cases, autopsy would generally be encouraged. So this makes me uncomfortable, right? I work in healthcare and we really value autopsy. So from my secular hat, I want everyone to authorize an autopsy. From the Jewish halachic perspective, though, it's more nuanced, and you have to think about where you land in reviewing the texts. If you think generalized knowledge is enough of a value, we say save a life, it's like saving the whole world. I'm kind of on that page myself, but more conservative thinkers would say that may not be compelling enough. So you need to be aware of it. When you look at the advance directive from the conservative movement, you will see it's quite fascinating. They lay out some dilemmas and they offer you the choice of how you want to think about rabbinic disagreements. It's quite a sophisticated and complicated document, and it asks you to go through certain decisions. So let's go on now to the situation where the individual, perhaps a friend or family member of ours, has died. And there are two values we want to talk about. There's Kavod HaMet and Nichulim Avelim. So we've got honoring the dead, and Nichum Avelim, which is comforting the mourners. So both of them are going to dictate a lot of our actions. And how might that work? So I wanted to remind us, if you remember from the morning service, there's a passage from the Talmud that we read every day. And it says, these are the deeds that yield immediate fruit and continue to yield fruit in time to come. And one of them is attending the dead. In fact, attending the dead, meaning taking care of the dead and escorting the dead to burial, is sometimes considered the most pure of all the mitzvot. And why would that be?
Because you're doing it without the expectation of anything in return.
Perfect. Exactly. It's one of the mitzvot where the beneficiary can never help you, right? And yet we do it and hope it will be done for us because it's part of who we are as a people. Exactly. And we remind ourselves of this every day. So what are the pieces of honoring the dead? We bury the dead person quickly. We'll talk about that in a minute. We prepare the body with a special process of bathing, washing, and dressing the body in a very simple, modest garment. We do something called shmirah, which is watching, which means in more traditional settings, the body is never left alone. People remain present from the moment from the moment of death until burial. And they traditionally recite Psalms. Now, you might remember, perhaps you read about this, after 9/11, when many Jewish people died, there were students in New York City in the yeshivot, boys and girls, who made their way to the site and recited Psalms around the clock in shifts until the site was cleared as much as it could be, knowing that there were people buried in the rubble. And for days, they remained there. There are some very beautiful and moving stories about it. So the idea of being present until the body is properly and respectfully disposed of. Now, you've all been, I'm sure, to funerals, and kriya, is that familiar to you? What is kriya?
Tearing a garment.
Exactly. Kriya is tearing, exactly. And nowadays, we typically don't tear our clothing. There's the black ribbon over on the right-hand side of this picture. Typically, people place a torn ribbon on their clothing, but either one. And then we have the funeral itself, which includes eulogies, a beautiful, gorgeous melody, prayer, Al Malei Rachamim, which is to the God who comforts us. And then in a minute, we'll look at funeral practices. So let me show you this, see what questions you have.
The word for funeral in Judaism is levaya, which means accompanying. To accompany a person to their final resting place is an act of love and kindness for both the deceased and their family. The funeral may start at a funeral home, a synagogue or graveside, and there are a few practices worth noting. Men, even non-Jews, are often expected to cover their heads. Don't expect an open casket, as it's traditionally considered disrespectful in Jewish practice. Note there probably won't be any flowers, as they represent life, and this is a time about death. Depending on the community, it's unlikely you'll talk to the immediate family of mourners until after the funeral. The funeral involves prayers, psalms, and a eulogy. After the service, the pallbearers are generally called to the front. Everyone rises as the casket is carried out. Immediate mourners walk behind the casket, and everyone else follows. At the cemetery, the pallbearers carry the casket from the hearse to the grave, where it's then lowered, and you say a few more prayers. Then each person shovels or throws a handful of dirt onto the grave. Some do this 3 times. Don't hand the shovel to the next person, just stick it back into the dirt, as this powerful and important mitzvah is an individual obligation. At the conclusion, you'll form 2 parallel lines that the mourners pass through, a symbol of the community joining together to show support. While they walk through the line, one thing people say is Hamakom inachem etchem, or simply, may God comfort you. When leaving the cemetery, it's customary to wash your hands without drying them, a symbol that you're leaving a place of death and re-entering the world of the living. Now begins the Shiva period, with many powerful rituals to learn about. Learn about the customs of Shiva and how to make a Shiva call in the next part of this series.
Any questions, thoughts, things that surprised you? Anything new to you? Perhaps you've been to funerals and this simply confirms what you've already seen.
I've never seen the washing of hands, but Ed says he has, and I've never seen the 2 rows.
Yeah.
I think that's a terrific idea. But I've never seen it.
Yeah, I see it consistently in the more traditional funerals, and I agree with you, it's beautiful. Where do you see the washing of hands?
The Passover Seder.
No. I've seen washing of hands when after the funeral coming back to the home for the Shiva, that they'd have a washing stand outside, or people wash their hands before they came into the house.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, we'll talk about Shiva in a few minutes for certain. Anything else that was surprising? So for those who come to Judaism from a different background, the fact that there's no wake, the fact that there's no open casket might seem surprising. Not all traditions, of course, have those, but those are certainly notable differences for people who are new to Judaism. What's going on between the person's death and the funeral? So that's where we talk about the first phase, Aninut. When you are an Ani, a mourner, the immediate family is experiencing this period of really suspension, right? The person has died but is not yet buried. And we try to bury folks as quickly as we can, often within 24 hours, but for many reasons, it can be a little bit more prolonged. Could we have to wait perhaps till Shabbat is over? Occasionally there's, waiting for family to arrive, etc. During those 3 days, they're not quite mourners. They're not sitting Shiva yet. They're kind of waiting. It's a very difficult time. Okay, now we go to Shiva. We have the burial. We go back to the home. And as Ed said, the first thing we're going to experience probably is a bowl of water and a pitcher to pour water and wash our hands symbolically. What else do you experience in a Shiva home?
Mirrors are covered.
The mirrors are covered. Yeah. Yeah. And that would be because
We shouldn't be seeing our own vanity and looking at the mirrors, and that we should be considering the person who's passed on.
right, and we may not look so great right now, depending on how sad.
Well, but that's it. You don't, whether we look good or not, but
We
that's the
don't care.
point. You shouldn't be concerned about that.
Exactly.
That's we're concerned about more essential things, which are life and death and the person who's we've lost.
Exactly. Right. Right. And how does the Shiva work? When you arrive, the mourners might be seated on low chairs. The mourners will not welcome you. They will not greet you. And your way of expressing comfort, typically, it's very hard not to say, "How are you doing?" because that's such a natural human thing, but we don't want to quiz them or grill them or make them talk, actually. The point is simply to be there. And so we approach them, maybe there's a hug, maybe there's a, "I'm so sorry." Maybe there's sharing memories of the person who's gone. Often there are photos that the family has pulled out that can trigger some wonderful memories and so forth. So there can be sharing, but the number one objective is simply to be there and to offer comfort any way the person wants. Does that line up with your experience? Yeah.
That's what we should do, but I've had experiences where then some of the friends of the departed come, particularly when they're younger and friends, and they will break. I've seen it where they break down and cry in front of the relatives or the family or the parents, and it makes it worse for them. But it's hard. It's really hard.
Oh, that's hard. I think we need to grieve together.
Yes.
Yeah.
I always try to think about something positive I can say about the person if I knew him and how good a friend he was, or how it's some positive aspect of the person or our relationship. How I happen to know them, and it just doesn't apply to Jewish funerals. As I have a very diverse set of acquaintances and friends, and not all of them are follow Judaism. So then I try and find something, and I will adjust to whatever the circumstances are. As many of friends of people we know are Jewish may not be, and I respect when they try and adjust and attend Shiva. That way, they show a sincere appreciation of the person, although there might be a different religious belief that they follow.
Yeah. So after the Shiva, which traditionally would be 7 days, and is rarely in the conservative movement, rarely 7 days, but could be. Quite often people will at least observe Shiva for 3 days, but everyone's different. Then the next 23 days continue into a period of Shloshim, or 30, right? Which is what Shloshim means. And that is also a period of restricted activity for the mourners, but they're not having an open house every night or having mourners come over as much. And then at the end of Shloshim, what happens? Do you recall? What happens to sort of mark that? Susan?
That you go for a sort of symbolic walk around the neighborhood that marks your reentry into life as a non-mourner.
Exactly. Right. You're still in that first year. If we look over here, right, you're still going to be saying Kaddish every day with a minyan. And we should talk about Kaddish actually. You start saying Kaddish after the funeral. The idea is to say Kaddish daily with a minyan during Shiva, and often that's part of the Shiva afternoon or evening when the mourners, all the friends participate. Then the 30 days, there's continuing to say Kaddish with the minyan. And then the 11 months begins after that Shloshim, in which typically the mourners are returned to daily life. They return to work and other activities. Many people will limit their festive activities during those 11 months, but they will try to say Kaddish every day for that period of time. And then what marks the end of the 11 months quite often? Anybody remember? So quite often there will be the headstone will be placed at that time, right? And these are customs. People observe in different ways. And then we come to the yahrzeit. And that, I think everyone is very familiar with, is the anniversary of the person's death on the Hebrew calendar, is what we observe each year. And typically there's a candle that is kindled, that is lit. Kaddish is said, again, with a minyan on that anniversary, indefinitely, forever. And then 3 times a year, there's a Yizkor service as part of the festivals, and then on Yom Kippur, right?
Mhm.
And that's kind of what they call the mourner's path. Any questions about that? All familiar, probably, to what you've experienced. There's a brief video on Kaddish, which I will share.
There's a surprising history behind one of Judaism's most famous and most powerful prayers. The Kaddish is thought to have originated in temple times. It was recited after a rabbinic lecture, a way to remember that all those specifics of Jewish law were part of a much bigger picture. Many scholars think that the lecturer would end his talk by freestyling some words of praise in Aramaic, the language of the day. According to this theory, the Kaddish was the result of one such freestyling, integrating language from the books of Ezekiel, Daniel, Job, and Psalms. Eventually, these particular words stuck and became standard. The Kaddish didn't become associated with death and mourning until the 7th century. Probably what happened was this. If a scholar died, someone would teach some of his wisdom at the funeral, maybe as part of the eulogy. Since Torah was being taught, then they'd say the Kaddish afterwards. But it wasn't long before some people began to get offended. Wait, you said Kaddish at that guy's funeral, but not our beloved deceased? What, are you trying to say that our beloved deceased wasn't a great scholar? So, it began to become standard to teach Torah at everybody's funeral. Then, eventually, saying Kaddish itself became part of the standard mourning practice. As Rabbi Maurice Lamb put it, the Kaddish serves as an epilogue to human life, just as, historically, it served as an epilogue to Torah study. It's a way for mourners to get into a space of praise, even in their grief. It's a way to honor the life of the deceased, to sanctify God's name as part of affirming their relative's legacy. And we need a quorum of Jews in order to say Kaddish, because when we're mourning, we should be in community. Eventually, the Kaddish moved its way into every prayer service, serving as something of a punctuation mark that demarcates different sections of the liturgy. The words of the Kaddish don't actually talk about study at all. Rather, they're praises to God and hopes for divine sovereignty and peace. And not just praises, but heaps and piles of praises. Yitbarach, v'yishtabach, v'yitpa'al, v'yitromam, v'yitnaseh, v'yitadal, v'yitaleh, v'yitlal. Blessed and praised, glorified and exalted, extolled and honored, adored and lauded may be the name of the Holy One. Blessed be God. It's a lot. It's meant to be a lot. It's meant to overwhelm you. It's about taking you to this place of glory and exaltation and not holding back at all. Let it all out. But the real power of the prayer was thought to be in the congregational response to the first paragraph. Yehei Shmei Rabba Mevorach Le'olam Omeil Maya. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi asserts that he who responds, Amen, may God's great name be blessed with all his might, his decreed sentence is torn up. Our response matters. We're not meant to stand passively on the sidelines of all of this praise, but to enter into the space of profound awe and glory ourselves. And to that, let us say, Amen.
So that's a little jaunty for me for a discussion of death and mourning, but it is interesting. Any surprises or comments? So you've probably noticed how many times the Kaddish is inserted into our services. And then also, you've probably noticed that it doesn't mention death. And many people are curious why it's part of the funeral. And now you can answer that question. So the last thing we want to touch on is we've had a respectful treatment of the body. We've buried the person. What comes next? And as people often say, no one has yet come back to report, so we don't know. But there are several theories in our tradition, and at least one of them might surprise you. So resurrection is included in the liturgy, so I'm sure you have noticed that in the daily prayer, in the Amidah, we talk about resurrection of the dead, that there is some idea that at some point there will be a return. The people will be lifted up and restored to some kind of life. We don't know what that might be. There's also a concept, not perhaps of heaven in the secular sense, but of the world to come, of a place, of an incarnation, an essence where souls reside after this one. And many, many, many texts talk about what we must do to merit, to deserve entry into Olam Haba, the world to come. And the one that might surprise you is the idea of Gilgul HaNefesh, reincarnation. That in fact, maybe people, souls, actually get placed in another human, or perhaps even a non-human reincarnation. It's not a dominant idea, but it's a thread in our tradition. Have you encountered these all previously? Yeah.
Yes.
Surprising, but they are definitely there, and different traditions emphasize different aspects of them. There are many, many beautiful midrashim of what goes on in the world to come, in particular, Olam Haba. And there are speculations by the rabbis in the Talmud of what it might be like, what kinds of conversations go on there, how there could be an encounter, for example, between Moses and Rabbi Akiva, who were, a millennium apart, etc. So lots and lots of dreaming and wondering and speculating about these beautiful ideas. I've put together some resources that might interest you. Two of them were referenced in your packet, the Maurice Lamb and the Elliot Dorff, and I recommend them very, very highly. The Maurice Lamb is really kind of a handbook on the basic sort of rules and thinking about this topic. And the Elliot Dorff, if you're interested in getting a little bit more technical into the halacha and how it gets applied in Jewish medical ethics, and I certainly, my copy of this book is completely scribbled up, and I've used it quite a lot. The others are, and then the Neil Gilman is really fascinating if you're interested in study. It's an academic book written, though, for popular audiences. Neil Gilman was a rabbi at Jewish Theological Seminary, and this is an exploration of how our tradition has treated these concepts and kind of his own reflections on them. But from a personal level, the first two might be of particular interest to you. The Rabbinic Assembly does have, and I looked again, this appears to be their most current publication. It's from 1994. And as I mentioned, it's a very complex advanced directive, which takes you through different disagreements and offers you the chance to make your own determination among the options. It was developed, I think, mainly by Rabbi Aaron Mackler, there's another book that he wrote on these topics that I use quite a bit. And then Carrie Olitsky, who I think comes maybe out of the Reform or Renewal movement, I'm not sure, has a beautiful, beautiful book that I highly recommend. Perhaps you've encountered it, with a daily meditation for that whole first year. That is, many, many people have really found it very, very helpful. Different texts and meditations for every day. So those are some resources. The Rabbinical Assembly and the conservative movement do not say that you must use their document. They do not say don't use the approved advanced directives in your state. But this is a document with a nice little introduction and different choices that does, if you're interested in the specifically Jewish dilemmas and debates on end-of-life care, it does help kind of walk through those. To your earlier point, Charles, the state of medical science is constantly changing, and the decisions that one might have to make in 2021 are not the same decisions we were making in 1994. But the principles are there, and most, I think, every hospital I know of has an ethics committee. They may not have a Jewish expert, but you can always find a chaplain or another resource, or of course the rabbi, to help think through those decisions and how they fit, how today's complicated decisions fit these more ancient principles, which I recommend
Right.
to you.
Well, I was going to add in that commentary is that if you're able to prolong life, even if it's a few years by some treatment, there may be new treatments developed or discoveries that then would overcome the condition or help allow people to continue for decades, possibly.
Yep, that's exactly right.
Those experiences aren't too far from home for our family.
Exactly.
And I'm so from some personal experiences, I know that if you're able to do that, that can make a difference. And then you're able to contribute. You're able to contribute even though you may be somewhat impeded or not be what you were earlier in life. There's so many things that you can do to help other people, affect your family and other things if you're able to still continue to contribute in one way or another to many aspects of other people's lives. So that's when I think about these things, that's my focus for whatever good it is.
It's very good, yeah, and very consistent with what we talked about. Yeah, now I want to ask you for your reflections on this discussion. David says you do this every class. Is this true? Sort of yes, sort of no. Maybe you don't always have time. But things that surprised you or you find difficult, something that's not fully explored?
Every time I participate in one of these morning activities on Sunday mornings, and somebody asked me when I first started to participate, but we know you for years. Why do you need an introduction? There's always something more I can learn. There's more subtleties and more details, and so. Boy,
do I agree.
Right, and so you've added this conversation because just living life for these years as a being born as a Jew and having experienced these things I've learned by doing or participating, but all these subtleties that I'm learning because I never had a very in-depth formal education into most of this or attended classes. So that's why I'm learning and appreciating it. And it's hard to define precisely what it is, but it gives me a much broader basis of understanding.
Right. Thank you.
It points to different resources. I mean, I think that's what David was wanting to know about this when he asked for the survey. So that's my input to that.
Beautiful. If I were going to do this again, is there something you would want to see more or less of, or amplified or different?
I'm interested in the medical ethics part of it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That would be
we could
interesting.
we could spend a long time. There's many complicated questions, but the fundamental principles, we did touch on. The body doesn't belong to us. Life is precious, even just a few hours or days. And at the same time, if something is merely a barrier for someone actively dying, imminently dying, then we are permitted to remove those barriers. So complicated in application, for certain. Anything, Susan, anything you want to add?
Well, it was really very interesting. I really appreciate you going through the book recommendations at the end. There are about 3 of them that I really want to look into more. It's very interesting and helpful. Thank you.
I only shared my favorites. There are tons more. Okay, well, thank you all for participating. And if you have other follow-up questions, let me know.
Thank you, Cindy.
very
Thanks,
much.
everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.